A black athlete minding her own business on a plane suddenly gets kicked off by a flight attendant. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Just 10 minutes later, the flight attendant who caused the chaos is fired. But why? Was it just a mistake, or is there something more behind it? You won't believe how this story unfolds. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe for more. It was a typical flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, and everything seemed to be running smoothly until a professional basketball player, rising in the ranks and catching the attention of fans everywhere, found herself at the center of an unexpected incident. She boarded the flight, her ticket clearly marking her seat, a spot she had reserved well in advance. She settled in, not thinking twice about the journey ahead. But just as the plane was about to close its doors and taxi down the runway, a flight attendant approached her. There was no smile, no friendly greeting, just a cold, direct demand to move. "You're in the wrong seat," the flight attendant said, pointing to the empty seat across the aisle. The athlete was confused. She checked her boarding pass again and assured the flight attendant that this was indeed her seat. But the flight attendant wasn't convinced. "You need to move," she repeated, more forcefully this time. A little taken aback, the athlete tried to explain, showing the flight attendant her assigned seat. Still, the flight attendant insisted that she was mistaken. A few passengers started to notice the tension rising. Some watched in confusion, while others whispered to each other. The situation was becoming uncomfortable. For a moment, the athlete considered moving, but she realized something was off. Why was this happening? She had flown many times before and never faced such an issue. After a brief pause, she stood her ground. "This is my seat," she said calmly but firmly, keeping her voice level. And that's when things took a turn. The flight attendant's attitude shifted. Her tone became harsher, and before anyone could understand what was happening, the flight attendant called for security. The passengers were stunned. What had started as a simple misunderstanding seemed to escalate into something much more serious in a matter of moments. The athlete remained calm, trying to de-escalate the situation, but the flight attendant was not backing down. Within minutes, airport security arrived at the gate. The flight attendant, now visibly frustrated, pointed to the athlete, and the security officers stepped forward. Without a clear explanation or any proper warning, the athlete was told she had to leave the plane. The passengers were shocked, but there was nothing they could do. One minute she was on board, ready for a long flight ahead. The next, she was being escorted off the plane. Her belongings were hastily gathered, and she was ushered down the jetway, back onto the airport tarmac. Some passengers tried to protest, others whispered in disbelief. But the situation was over before anyone fully understood what had happened. The athlete, confused and shaken, found herself standing alone outside the plane. Her dream of a peaceful journey suddenly turned upside down. As the athlete stood on the tarmac, the door to the plane slammed shut behind her, leaving her in a haze of confusion. She was still trying to process what had just happened. How did things escalate so quickly? She had been calm, polite, and respectful, yet now she was standing outside, her seat on the plane taken from her without any clear reason. What had started as an unfortunate misunderstanding now felt like something much more serious. In the terminal, the athlete was quickly approached by airline staff. They apologized for the situation but gave no real explanation. "We'll rebook you on the next available flight," one of the staff members said. But that was small comfort. The athlete had a full schedule to keep, sponsors to meet, and commitments to honor. Time was not on her side. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had she been singled out? Why had the flight attendant insisted she leave the plane, especially when her ticket clearly stated she was in the correct seat? As she made her way to the customer service desk to figure out what had just happened, her phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was already buzzing with the story. The situation had taken a life of its own, with some passengers sharing what they had witnessed. The athlete's fans, already outraged at the news, quickly began to rally behind her. The news quickly made its way through online communities. where accusations of racial discrimination began to surface. Many couldn't help but wonder if the athlete, a black woman, had been treated unfairly because of her race. The story spread fast, and before long, news outlets began to pick it up. Within an hour, what had seemed like a minor incident had turned into a viral event. People online began to demand answers. How could an airline allow something like this to happen? Why hadn't the situation been handled differently? The spotlight had shifted, and now the airline found itself under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, the flight attendant whose actions had led to the ordeal likely had no idea what was about to unfold. In just a matter of minutes, the athlete's simple flight had transformed into something much larger. A public incident that had sparked a national conversation about race, authority, and the treatment of passengers in the airline industry. The question now wasn't just about why she had been kicked off the plane, but about the broader issue of how racial biases could potentially play a role in public spaces, especially when authority figures like flight attendants are involved. Back at the gate, the athlete was seated in a small, uncomfortable lounge area, her thoughts racing. She was trying to make sense of everything that had just happened, but it felt like her mind couldn't keep up with the whirlwind of emotions. It wasn't just the shock of being removed from the plane that troubled her. It was the fact that she felt completely powerless. She'd done everything right, and yet here she was, sitting alone in an airport terminal, with no clear explanation for why she had been treated this way. She scrolled through her phone, reading more of the angry posts and comments from people who had witnessed the incident. Some passengers had taken to social media, sharing their version of events. According to some, they had seen the flight attendant approach the athlete with a sense of impatience from the very beginning. The tone of the exchange had been tense, and it only got worse as the confrontation went on. One passenger had even mentioned overhearing the flight attendant make a remark under her breath that sounded less than professional. Was it possible that the flight attendant's actions were motivated by something other than just a mistake about the seating? A few minutes later, the airline staff approached her again, this time with an apology. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and the airline needed to manage the fallout. They offered her a new flight and promised to compensate her for the inconvenience. But as she looked at them, the athlete couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. This wasn't just about getting rebooked or receiving a refund. The way the entire situation had been handled, the way she had been treated like a problem rather than a customer, made her wonder if this was the kind of service everyone received, or if she had been singled out for a reason. As the minutes ticked by, she noticed a security guard walking toward her. The man seemed to have an air of authority about him, and he glanced in her direction as if expecting her to speak. Was he here to question her, or was he just a figurehead, here to show the airline was taking charge of the situation? The athlete stood up, her mind still swirling with questions. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be something she could easily forget. Meanwhile, back at the airport, things were heating up online. The story had gained momentum and was quickly becoming one of the most talked about incidents of the day. News outlets had picked up the story, and many were speculating on the cause of the altercation. Some even began to raise the uncomfortable possibility that the flight attendant's actions may have been motivated by racial bias. As social media posts spread, the public was divided. Some people backed the flight attendant, claiming she was just doing her job, while others sided with the athlete, demanding accountability for what seemed like an unjustified removal from the plane. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and what had started as a simple misunderstanding was beginning to look like something much more serious. What would the airline do to address the mounting pressure? Would they take responsibility for what had happened, or would they try to sweep it under the rug? The athlete could only wait and wonder how long it would take before she had answers, if she ever would. As the minutes turned into hours, the athlete remained in the terminal, her thoughts still tangled in confusion and frustration. She'd been rebooked on another flight, but it wasn't enough to calm her nerves. The entire ordeal was still playing in her mind over and over again. Why had the flight attendant been so insistent, so harsh? There was no logical explanation for why she had been treated like an inconvenience or a threat. And what made matters worse was the growing speculation that something deeper, something darker, had influenced the situation. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her agent. The message read, "The airline just issued a statement. They're calling it a misunderstanding and offering their apologies. They say the flight attendant was unaware of the seating arrangements. They've promised to look into it." The words "look into it" hit her hard. It felt like a canned response, a way to deflect from the real issue. She wasn't just some customer who had been inconvenienced. This had gone beyond a simple error. She knew it. The people who had witnessed the incident knew it. And deep down, the airline knew it too. The athlete had been singled out, and now they were scrambling to cover their tracks. But what troubled her most was the sudden shift in the narrative. While the airline was sticking to their misunderstanding story, social media was filled with posts calling attention to the way the flight attendant had spoken to her, the impatience in her voice, the unnecessary escalation, and of course the biggest question on everyone's mind: was this racial discrimination? Many people online were already making the connection, pointing out the athlete's race as a factor that couldn't be ignored. Some passengers had even reported overhearing the flight attendant's tone, which they claimed had been dismissive and rude from the moment she boarded. This wasn't just about seating. This was about how one person had been treated by someone in authority. The athlete knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about her and one unfortunate flight. The incident had turned into something much bigger. A conversation about how Black athletes, especially women, are treated in spaces that are supposed to be neutral, like airplanes, hotels, and public venues. She thought about the countless stories she had heard from other athletes. Stories of being questioned, ignored, or unfairly targeted because of their race. It wasn't just a one-off occurrence. It was a pattern. And now she had been thrust into the middle of it. As she boarded her new flight, there was a sense of unease in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced similar situations and stayed silent. She looked around the cabin, observing the other passengers. Was anyone else feeling the tension, the unease in the air? She couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning, that her experience might be the catalyst for a much larger conversation. This wasn't going to go away anytime soon. Back at the airline's headquarters, they were facing mounting pressure. The incident had reached the news, and the backlash was growing. People were demanding accountability, not just for the flight attendant's actions, but for the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to happen unchecked. The airline was trying to contain the damage, but it was clear that they were in damage control mode. And as the athlete settled into her new seat, watching the plane's engines roar to life, she knew that her fight wasn't over yet. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now a question of fairness, justice, and respect. And she wasn't going to let it go quietly. While the airline scrambled to control the narrative, the flight attendant at the center of it all, whose name was later revealed as Amanda, remained oblivious to the growing storm. In her mind, the incident with the athlete had been resolved as soon as the athlete was escorted off the plane. She carried on with her duties, avoiding eye contact with other passengers, but maintaining an air of professionalism, or so she thought. However, Amanda's obliviousness was short-lived. Just moments after takeoff, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Amanda noticed passengers glancing at their phones, some turning their screens toward their neighbors, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A particularly bold passenger called out, "Hey, Amanda, did you see what's trending?" The flight attendant froze. Her name wasn't mentioned, but the tone suggested it had everything to do with her. Unable to check her phone, Amanda ignored the comment and focused on finishing her beverage service. Her hands trembled as she handed out drinks. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What was once a routine flight now felt charged with unspoken tension. Amanda was used to being in control, but now she felt like the center of a storm she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, back on the ground, the airline's PR team was working overtime. News outlets had begun airing footage taken by passengers during the incident. The clips showed Amanda speaking to the athlete in a firm, almost dismissive tone. The video captured the moment security arrived, and the athlete was removed, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to Amanda's evident frustration. The internet was quick to react, with hashtags like #airline-bias and #justice-for-athlete trending within hours. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Amanda walked down the aisle to check on passengers. She overheard snippets of conversation. "Can you believe she's still working? I'd demand a refund if I were her." Every word felt like a dagger. Amanda clenched her jaw, her usual confidence unraveling. In first class, one of the passengers, a man in his late 50s with a sharp suit and an air of authority, pressed his call button. Amanda approached him, forcing a polite smile. "How can I assist you, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The man looked her in the eye, his expression unreadable. "I think you should sit down," he said quietly. "You might want to hear what's being said about you right now." Amanda's heart sank. For the first time, she realized that whatever was happening wasn't just a misunderstanding that would blow over. This was bigger than her, bigger than one flight. She had no idea that the man speaking to her was one of the airline's regional directors. As he handed her his tablet, showing her a news article with her photo plastered across the screen, Amanda's world began to tilt. The headline read, "Flight attendant sparks outrage after athlete's removal. Racial bias alleged." For the rest of the flight, Amanda went through the motions, her mind racing. She couldn't stop replaying the incident in her head, wondering where it had all gone so wrong. As she served drinks and collected trash, she realized the passengers' murmurs weren't dying down. They were growing louder. She had become the topic of conversation on her own flight, and there was nowhere to hide. By the time the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Amanda's nerves were frayed, her mind spinning with what had just transpired. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to explode. And sure enough, as soon as the doors opened, a team of airport security officers was waiting by the jet bridge. They didn't approach her immediately, but the sight of them made her stomach twist. She had never been so acutely aware of her surroundings. As the passengers disembarked, many glanced at her, some with pity, others with disdain. A few exchanged knowing looks, whispering to each other, their eyes never leaving Amanda. She kept her head down, trying to keep her composure, but she could feel their gaze burning into her back. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. It wasn't until Amanda made her way to the crew lounge that she realized just how serious the situation had become. The usual buzz of the lounge was absent. Instead, her colleagues sat in hushed conversation, their eyes darting toward her every few seconds. One of the senior flight attendants, Linda, approached her with a somber expression. "Amanda, I think we need to talk," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amanda's heart dropped. Linda was one of the senior attendants, someone who always had her back, and now she was looking at her like she had done something wrong. "What's going on?" Amanda asked, trying to mask the panic in her voice. Linda sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "There's an investigation, Amanda. Passengers are talking about the incident and it's getting out of hand. There are allegations about racial bias, and honestly, the company's concerned. You might want to brace yourself." Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. "An investigation for what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For what happened on that flight. For the way you handled the situation with the athlete," Linda explained. "You know how things have been on social media. It's bad, Amanda." Amanda's mind was racing. She had never intended for any of this to happen. She had simply done her job, or at least that's what she had thought. But now, it seemed like her actions had sparked something much bigger than herself. The thought of an investigation made her feel like she was sinking, her breath shallow and panicked. She looked at Linda, who offered her a sympathetic smile but didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. The truth was, the airline had no choice but to respond. The storm was too big to ignore. As Amanda sat down in a corner of the lounge, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her supervisor. The message read, Please report to HR as soon as you're able. The investigation into the incident is moving forward. You will be briefed shortly." Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. The weight of the situation hit her all at once. She had heard of other flight attendants who had been let go over much smaller issues, and now it seemed like her career was teetering on the edge. The feeling of dread settled in her chest as she stood up, knowing what she had to do next. She walked slowly to the HR office, her steps echoing in the quiet hallway, each one bringing her closer to a reality she was not prepared for. She had no idea what the investigation would reveal, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. When Amanda entered the HR office, she was met by a cold silence. Her supervisor, along with 2 other HR representatives, sat across from her, their expressions neutral, but their eyes sharp with scrutiny. The room, once familiar and welcoming, now felt like a courtroom, each corner filled with tension. "Amanda," her supervisor James began, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you for joining us. We are here to discuss the incident that occurred during your flight yesterday. As you know, there have been serious allegations regarding your handling of the situation with the athlete. It's been documented, discussed publicly, and we need to address it." Amanda's mouth went dry. She had expected something like this, but now that it was happening, the reality of the situation hit her hard. I don't understand," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just doing my job. The athlete wasn't in the right seat, and when she didn't move, I had to call for security." James exchanged a brief glance with the other 2 HR representatives, who nodded in silent agreement. One of them, a woman named Linda, spoke next. "Amanda, the issue isn't just about the seat. It's how you handled the interaction. From the moment you approached the athlete, witnesses say your tone was dismissive, and when the situation escalated, it became clear to others that the way you treated her didn't match the way you treated other passengers. This has raised serious concerns about racial bias." The words hit Amanda like a slap, and she recoiled internally. "I didn't treat her differently because of her race," Amanda protested. "I don't even know what you're talking about." Linda's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the gravity of her words. "It's not just what you did, Amanda, it's how it looked. There's a perception problem now. You were forceful, dismissive, and people on the plane began to question if race was a factor in the way you treated her. You need to understand that perception is just as important as reality in situations like this." Amanda was silent for a long moment, the weight of their words settling heavily in her chest. She had never considered how her actions might be perceived, nor had she thought about how a simple misunderstanding could spiral into something much larger. She had simply been trying to maintain order, but now she realized she might have gone about it the wrong way, much the same way that others had accused her of handling similar situations in the past. The thought that she might have been subconsciously influenced by her own biases struck her hard. James leaned forward, his voice serious. "Amanda, you've been with the company for a long time. You've built a reputation as a reliable, professional flight attendant. But this incident, it's not just about one bad moment. There are multiple reports of passengers feeling mistreated or overlooked because of your actions. Some passengers have come forward about previous flights where they felt you were dismissive or treated them unfairly. We need to know what's going on." Amanda's eyes widened as she took in their words. She had been working with the airline for over a decade, and this was the first time she'd ever been in a situation like this. She had always prided herself on being professional, on following the rules, and yet here she was, sitting in front of HR, facing a serious investigation into her behavior. I didn't mean to cause harm," Amanda said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've never thought about things like this, bias, race, the way I treat people. I just thought I was doing my job, following the rules like I always do. But if I've made people feel like that, then I need to understand why." The silence that followed was heavy, but for the first time, Amanda wasn't just feeling defensive. She was genuinely questioning herself. She had never seen the deeper implications of her actions until now. never thought about the invisible lines she might have been crossing. Her eyes began to well up with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology feeling like a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. James nodded slowly, his expression softening. "We appreciate your honesty, Amanda, and we need you to understand that this is not just a matter of fixing one bad interaction. It's about understanding the culture that allowed this to happen. There will be consequences, but the most important thing right now is to see if you're willing to learn from this, to do better." Linda spoke up again, her voice calm but direct. "We're offering you the opportunity to go through cultural sensitivity training. It's not just a punishment. It's a chance for you to reflect on these issues, to address any blind spots, and to help prevent something like this from happening again. You can choose to take it or not, but if you choose to stay with this company, it's going to be part of your professional development." Amanda swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing as she nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't want to be the kind of person who causes harm, even unintentionally. I'll take the training. I need to understand." James sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Good. This is a step in the right direction. We're not firing you, Amanda, but this will be an ongoing process. We'll be watching how you handle this, and whether you're genuinely committed to making changes." As Amanda left the HR office, the weight of the situation continued to bear down on her. She had been given a chance, but now she realized that it would take much more than just following rules. She would have to confront her own biases, challenge the way she had seen the world, and learn to become a better version of herself. For the first time, she truly understood how easy it was to overlook the things that seemed so natural to her, but were hurtful to others. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a person who needed to change. And that journey had just begun. The next few days felt like a blur to Amanda. After the meeting with HR, she was sent home to reflect on the situation, and the weight of the last few days hung over her like a storm cloud. She had never been one to shy away from responsibility, but this time was different. It wasn't just about an isolated mistake. It was about how deep the issues ran. It wasn't just her job that was on the line. It was her character, her reputation, and everything she had worked for in the past decade. Amanda spent the next few days reading up on cultural sensitivity, diversity, and bias. At first, it felt like an uncomfortable exercise, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. She didn't want to believe that she, someone who had always prided herself on being fair, could be part of a system that perpetuated bias. But as she read more, as she learned more, she couldn't deny that her behavior, however well-intentioned, had been shaped by unconscious biases she hadn't recognized before. She found articles on microaggressions, subtle slights that people often didn't notice, but which hurt all the same. She read about how certain body language and tones could be perceived as dismissive or even discriminatory. It was an eye-opening experience, and for the first time she started to understand what people had been trying to tell her, what her actions had been saying to others, even when she didn't mean it. The cultural sensitivity training session was set to begin a few days later, but the days in between were filled with uneasy reflection. Amanda spent hours thinking back over her career, each passenger interaction, every decision she made, every glance she shared with a colleague. Had she been inadvertently treating certain passengers differently based on their appearance? She hadn't thought about it before, but now the realization stung. When the day of the training arrived, Amanda felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. This was her chance to change, to prove not just to her colleagues but to herself that she could grow. She arrived at the training center early, her uniform feeling slightly too tight, as if it no longer represented the same person she had been. The room was filled with other flight attendants, some she recognized, others she didn't. It was a mix of experienced staff and newer recruits. The instructor, a woman named Rachel, greeted everyone warmly. Her smile was genuine, but there was a professionalism in her tone that let everyone know this wasn't going to be a typical training session. It wasn't just about brushing up on safety protocols or customer service. This was about confronting the uncomfortable truths that had been lurking beneath the surface for too long. Rachel started the session with a short video highlighting real-life scenarios of passengers who had experienced discrimination. Some subtle, others overt. Amanda watched as a woman of color was shown sitting in first class, only to be told by a flight attendant that she was in the wrong seat, even though her boarding pass was correct. The video cut to another example, where a Hispanic family was asked by the flight crew to move to the back of the plane, despite having paid for premium seating. The passengers, bewildered and hurt, shared their experiences in interviews after the fact, speaking about how those actions had made them feel less than human. Amanda felt the sting of each story. She had heard similar accounts in passing, but seeing them laid out so clearly, hearing the pain in the passengers' voices shook her to her core. Was this what she had been doing all along? Had she ever made someone feel like this? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the thought. Rachel spoke after the video, her voice soft but powerful. Discrimination doesn't always look like what we expect. It's not always someone shouting racial slurs or physically removing someone from a seat. Sometimes it's more subtle. It's the tone we use, the way we make assumptions, or the way we treat people differently based on how they look. We all have biases. It's not about whether we're good or bad people. It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences. Amanda swallowed hard. It was difficult to admit, but Rachel was right. She had to face the reality that her actions, however well-intentioned, had consequences. She thought back to the athlete she had confronted on the plane. At the time, she had justified it by thinking she was simply doing her job, but now she realized she had acted with impatience and without understanding. She had assumed the worst, and in doing so, she had caused harm. As the session continued, Amanda found herself listening more intently, her mind starting to open. The training wasn't easy. It forced her to confront parts of herself she had buried deep down. But with each exercise, she found herself gaining more clarity. They discussed body language, tone, and how to make sure that no matter what, passengers always felt respected and valued. They also worked on role-playing exercises, where Amanda had to interact with passengers who challenged her assumptions. Each scenario forced her to think before she acted, to pause and ask herself, how would I want to be treated in this situation? By the end of the day, Amanda was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but she felt something inside her shift. The training had been intense, but it had also been enlightening. She knew that the road to change wouldn't be quick or easy, but she was willing to take the first steps. As the group wrapped up, Rachel asked them all to share one thing they had learned. When it was Amanda's turn, she hesitated at first, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. But then, with a deep breath, she spoke up. I've always believed that I treated everyone fairly, that I did my job well. But this training has opened my eyes to how much I've been blind to. I've made mistakes, and I've hurt people without even realizing it. I'm here because I want to be better. I want to understand more and do better for the passengers I serve. There was a brief silence, and then Rachel nodded. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. It's not easy to admit our mistakes, but it's a crucial part of the process, and it sounds like you're on the right path. As Amanda left the training room that day, she felt a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew she had a long way to go, but she was ready. The person she had been wasn't the person she wanted to be anymore, and she would keep learning, keep growing, until she was better. For herself, for the passengers, and for her colleagues. This was just the beginning of her journey. The days following the cultural sensitivity training were a blur for Amanda. She returned to her regular shifts, but everything felt different. Her eyes were more open to the subtle things that once went unnoticed. The way passengers looked at her when she passed by, the way she interacted with her colleagues, and even her own internal thoughts. She realized how often she had taken things for granted, how she had simply assumed her way of doing things was the right way. On her first flight back after the training, Amanda found herself more aware than ever of her actions. She noticed when passengers seemed uncomfortable or hesitant, and instead of rushing through her tasks, she made an effort to approach each one with kindness and patience. A small gesture, like greeting someone with a smile or asking how their day was going, felt different now. She wasn't just going through the motions, she was paying attention. But the challenge wasn't just about changing how she treated others. It was about confronting her own internal biases. Amanda spent time reflecting on how she had approached certain passengers in the past. Had she been more curt with those who seemed different from her? Had she been quicker to judge the young couple with a stroller than the older woman traveling alone? She couldn't ignore the truth that had become clear. She had been influenced by factors beyond just professionalism. She had made assumptions based on appearances, and in doing so, had treated people differently. One afternoon, as Amanda worked the aisle of the plane, she had an interaction that would serve as a turning point. An older woman struggling with her carry-on called out for help. Amanda was right there, but instead of rushing over with the usual efficiency, she took a moment to assess the situation. This time, she didn't just see an elderly woman with a bag. She saw a person who needed a bit of extra care. "Can I help you with that, ma'am?" Amanda asked, her tone warm and genuine. The woman smiled at her, clearly relieved. "Oh, thank you. I've been having trouble with my bag all day." As Amanda carefully placed the woman's bag in the overhead compartment, she couldn't help but notice how different this interaction felt from the many others she had had. She wasn't just doing her job, she was actively showing empathy, listening to the person in front of her, and treating them like an individual, not just a passenger. When she returned to her seat after finishing the cabin service, Amanda thought about how this small moment had made her feel. There was a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply doing her job. It was a feeling of connection, a recognition of the humanity in each passenger she served. That evening, as Amanda was going over her notes from the training, she received a message from Linda, one of the senior attendants. Linda was someone Amanda respected deeply, and it had been Linda who had quietly encouraged her to attend the cultural sensitivity training in the first place. The message was short, but its impact was immediate. "Hey Amanda, just wanted to say I've noticed a change in how you've been interacting with passengers. You've really been going the extra mile. Keep it up." Amanda felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had made progress, and though it was just a small step, it was a step in the right direction. It was validation that she was on the path toward real change, not just for herself, but for the people she interacted with daily. As the weeks passed, Amanda continued to focus on her growth. She started participating in open discussions about race and bias among her colleagues, something that felt foreign to her before the training. It was hard at first, confronting the ways she had been complicit in perpetuating systems of bias without even realizing it. But with each conversation, she felt herself becoming more aware of the power of empathy and understanding. Her colleagues began to notice the shift as well. They observed her more thoughtful approach to customer service, her genuine engagement with passengers, and her willingness to learn and grow. Slowly, Amanda started to rebuild the trust that had been shaken by the incident with the athlete. It wasn't just the big moments that mattered. It was the small, everyday interactions that made the difference. Every time Amanda offered a kind word to a nervous flyer or took the time to explain a safety procedure to a confused passenger, she was reaffirming her commitment to change. She had learned that the true essence of service wasn't about perfection. It was about treating people with dignity, regardless of their background, and being mindful of the ways she could contribute to a more inclusive, respectful environment. One afternoon, as Amanda walked down the aisle to collect trash from the passengers, a woman in her late 20s caught her attention. She was sitting alone in the aisle seat, scrolling through her phone, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. When Amanda approached her, the woman looked up, and their eyes met. "Is everything okay?" Amanda asked, her voice gentle. The woman hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I just feel like no one sees me. Like I'm invisible, you know." Amanda sat down next to her, not offering a quick solution but simply being present. I understand, Amanda said quietly. I've had days where I've felt the same way, but I see you. You matter, and I'm here if you need anything. The woman's eyes softened, and a small, appreciative smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Thank you, she said. It means a lot. Amanda didn't know what had been going on in the woman's life, but in that moment, she realized that sometimes the most important thing she could offer wasn't just her service. It was her humanity. As the plane landed and the passengers disembarked, Amanda felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had been able to connect with someone in a way that went beyond the typical flight attendant-passenger interaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in that moment, Amanda understood that change wasn't a one-time event. It was a process, a journey, and she was committed to it, no matter how long it took. When she returned to the crew room later that evening, Amanda was greeted by a fellow flight attendant, Carla, who had been with the airline for even longer than Amanda. I've been hearing some good things about you, Carla said, her tone casual but sincere. The way you've been handling yourself lately, it's noticeable. I'm proud of you. Amanda's heart warmed at the words. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly becoming the person she had always wanted to be. A flight attendant who didn't just do her job, but made a real difference in the lives of those she served. It wasn't just about fixing a mistake. It was about becoming better. Every day, one small step at a time. A few weeks after Amanda's cultural sensitivity training, things started to feel more natural. The initial discomfort of confronting her biases had faded, and in its place was a growing sense of purpose. Every flight was an opportunity for growth, not just for her, but for the people around her. She felt more attuned to her passengers, noticing things she had once overlooked. The nervous traveler clutching their boarding pass, the elderly couple struggling with their luggage, the young mother trying to calm her crying child. These weren't just passengers anymore. They were people, with lives and stories beyond the flight they were on. One evening, as Amanda was preparing for a late-night flight from Los Angeles to New York, something happened that reminded her how much she had changed. The flight was half full, and as she made her way down the aisle to start the drink service, she noticed a young man sitting by the window, his hands tightly gripping the armrests. His face was pale, and he seemed to be deep in thought, barely acknowledging her as she passed by. Amanda knew that look. It was the look of someone who was anxious or afraid of flying. She had seen it countless times before, but never had it felt so significant. This time, she stopped. Instead of just continuing with her routine, she leaned slightly toward him, offering a smile. "Hey, are you doing okay?" she asked gently. The man blinked in surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him. I'm fine, just not great with flying," he admitted quietly, his voice shaky. Amanda nodded, understanding all too well. She had been in his shoes many years ago, when flying had been a source of anxiety for her as well. "I get it. A lot of people do," she said. "If you need anything, even just to chat, I'm here. It helps to talk through it." The man seemed to relax slightly, his shoulders loosening as he exhaled deeply. "Thanks," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm trying, just kind of panicking." Amanda sat down in the seat next to him, her presence calm but reassuring. They talked for a few minutes. Nothing heavy, just small conversation. She told him about the best books she'd read on long flights, joked about how some passengers always seemed to find the smallest thing to complain about, and shared a few tips on relaxing during turbulence. By the time the plane was cruising at altitude, the young man had settled into his seat. His grip on the armrest had loosened, and while he was still a little tense, he was no longer visibly anxious. When Amanda passed by him again to check on everyone, he gave her a small but grateful smile. "Thank you for talking to me," he said. "I feel a lot better now." Amanda smiled back, a warmth filling her chest. "No problem," she said. "We're all in this together." As she continued down the aisle, she felt a quiet pride in herself. It wasn't just about the passengers. It was about her journey. How she had gone from someone who had overlooked the deeper implications of her actions to someone who was now actively looking for ways to make a difference, however small. She wasn't perfect, but she was learning, evolving, and striving to be better every single day. Back in the crew room after the flight, Amanda was met by Linda, who gave her a knowing look. "How's the new you doing?" she asked with a smile. Amanda chuckled, shaking her head. "Still a work in progress, but I'm getting there." Linda raised an eyebrow, but her expression softened. "I can see it," she said. "I've been hearing good things about your interactions with passengers lately. People are noticing, Amanda. It's not just about the job anymore, is it?" Amanda paused, reflecting on Linda's words. "No," she said after a moment. "It's not. It's about showing up for people, really seeing them. That's what I've been missing all this time. I didn't realize how much it matters until now." Linda smiled warmly, clapping Amanda on the back. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of you." Amanda smiled back, a little embarrassed but grateful. "Thanks, I couldn't have done it without the support, though. This whole thing has been a wake-up call." As the crew prepared for their next flight, Amanda found herself thinking about how far she had come. She had made mistakes, big ones, but she was on the path to redemption. More than that, she was beginning to see that change wasn't just something that happened to her. It was something she could actively create in her own life and in the lives of others. Every interaction, every choice, every moment was a chance to show kindness, patience, and understanding. The road ahead wasn't clear. Amanda knew there would be setbacks, moments where her old instincts might resurface. But she also knew she was committed to this journey, one step at a time, one flight at a time. And as she walked down the jetway for her next flight, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. She was doing the work, both inside and out, and that was enough for now. As the months passed, Amanda began to see the results of her efforts in small yet significant ways. She no longer just went through the motions of her job. She truly engaged with each passenger, every one of them now a person, not just a face in the crowd. She found herself noticing when a passenger needed a little extra help, whether it was a young father juggling his child in a carry-on bag, or an elderly woman struggling to stow her luggage in the overhead bin. The moments when she could make someone's day just a little easier had become the highlight of her shift. One morning, after a particularly long transcontinental flight, Amanda was helping a young couple with a baby. The parents were exhausted, trying to calm the fussy infant while juggling their bags. As Amanda helped them, she noticed the father looking over at her with a mix of relief and gratitude. "You're a lifesaver," he said, his voice tired but appreciative. Amanda smiled warmly. "Just doing my job. I know how it is, being a parent and traveling. It's not easy." The mother, clearly worn out, looked up at Amanda and smiled back. "It's nice to have someone actually care. We've had so many people just walk by without offering help." Amanda nodded, her heart swelling. She didn't know what had happened on their previous flights, but she knew what she could do now. It wasn't just about serving drinks or handing out snacks. It was about making the experience easier, more comfortable, and, most importantly, more human. As the couple settled back into their seats, Amanda took a moment to reflect on the interaction. She remembered when she first started as a flight attendant, how much of her focus had been on just getting through the day, getting the service done, keeping things moving. But now, she realized that it wasn't just about the job. It was about the relationships she built with people, even if it was just a few seconds of kindness in an otherwise routine flight. She had come a long way from the woman who had treated the athlete so harshly, the one who had been blind to the subtleties of bias and the impact of her actions. The change had been gradual, but it was undeniable. One day, after a shift, Amanda received a message from a passenger who had been on one of her recent flights. The message was simple but touched her deeply. "Thank you for making me feel seen today. Your kindness went a long way." It was a small thing, but Amanda knew that it wasn't just the passengers she was serving who had changed. It was herself. The real reward wasn't the compliments or recognition, but the satisfaction that came from knowing she was contributing to a better, more inclusive atmosphere. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and that was enough for now. But Amanda's transformation didn't go unnoticed by others either. Her colleagues began to see a difference too. One evening, as Amanda finished her shift and was getting ready to leave the crew lounge, Linda approached her, a thoughtful look on her face. "I've been watching you, Amanda," she said, "and I have to say the change is noticeable. You've really grown in the last few months. The way you're interacting with passengers, it's different. You're different." Amanda felt a rush of warmth mixed with a little surprise. "I've been trying," she admitted. "It's not always easy, but I want to do better. For them and for myself." Linda smiled knowingly. "It shows, and it's not just your passengers who are noticing. The team is too. You're a real leader in how you're handling things now." Amanda blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "Leader? Me?" Linda nodded. "Yeah. We need people like you. People who can show others that change is possible, that we can do better." Amanda felt a lump form in her throat. The words were humbling but also empowering. She had always been focused on following the rules, doing her job to the best of her ability. But now it seemed there was something more to her role, a chance to be a part of something larger than herself, to influence the atmosphere around her and make a real difference in how people experienced air travel. A few days later, during a company-wide meeting, Amanda was invited to speak about her journey, how she had embraced cultural sensitivity training, learned from her mistakes, and grown in her understanding of bias and inclusion. The thought of standing in front of her colleagues was nerve-wracking, but she knew that it was a chance to share her story. It wasn't just her transformation anymore. It was about creating a ripple effect, showing her peers that change was possible, even for those who never thought they needed to change in the first place. When the day came, Amanda stood at the front of the room, her palms slightly sweaty but her voice steady. She looked out at the crowd, her fellow flight attendants, supervisors, and even a few higher-ups who had gathered to hear her speak. It was the first time she had ever felt truly vulnerable in front of her colleagues, but as she began to speak, she realized that vulnerability was exactly what made her story so powerful. "I'll be honest," she started. "I didn't always get it. I didn't understand how my actions, however well-intentioned, could have hurt someone. I didn't realize the role bias played in my day-to-day interactions with passengers. But I've learned, and I'm still learning. I want to be someone who makes people feel seen and heard, not just because it's part of my job, but because it's the right thing to do." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I'm not perfect," she continued. "I've made mistakes, and I know I'll continue to make them. But I believe that if we all try to do better, if we all take the time to understand each other and approach each day with empathy, we can really change things. It's not about being a perfect flight attendant. It's about being a person who tries, who listens, and who respects everyone, no matter where they come from." The room was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, a few people began to clap. Amanda's heart swelled. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but in that moment, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger shift, not just in herself, but in the airline industry as a whole. As the meeting wrapped up, Amanda walked back to her seat, her steps lighter than they had been in a long time. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a part of something bigger. And that, she realized, was the true meaning of her journey. The following weeks were a mix of reflection and progress for Amanda. Her colleagues continued to notice the changes in her approach to work, and she could sense that she was slowly gaining their trust back. The training session she had led had opened the door to deeper conversations, and there were subtle shifts happening throughout the team. Amanda found herself more involved in team meetings, where the discussions about cultural sensitivity were no longer just about policies. They were about real experiences and shared growth. One day, as Amanda was preparing for her morning flight, she was approached by Carla, one of the newer attendants. Carla had been on the team for a few months and had been one of the first to observe Amanda's transformation. She smiled nervously before speaking, and Amanda, sensing a deeper conversation stopped what she was doing. "Hey, Amanda," Carla said quietly. "I wanted to talk to you about something. You've really inspired me these last few weeks. The way you've approached everything, how you've changed. I think it's made me look at myself too. I've realized I've got a lot of biases I never really thought about." Amanda was taken aback. She had always been the one learning, but now it seemed that her growth was starting to impact others in ways she hadn't fully understood. "Thank you, Carla," Amanda said, her voice soft but sincere. "It means a lot to hear that. I've learned so much myself, and I think we're all constantly learning. If you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here." Carla nodded. "I've been thinking about how I treat passengers, especially people who are different from me. There are things I've done out of habit that aren't right. I want to do better, like you have." Amanda smiled, feeling both proud and humbled. "We're all on this journey together. It's not always easy, but if we support each other, we can make real change." The conversation left Amanda feeling more connected to her colleagues than she had in a long time. She had always prided herself on being a professional, but now she understood that professionalism wasn't just about efficiency or following procedures. It was about empathy, respect, and a willingness to grow. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was part of a community that was actively trying to improve the way they interacted with each other and with the passengers they served. As the weeks turned into months, Amanda found herself involved in more leadership opportunities. She was asked to assist with new training initiatives, helping onboard new flight attendants with the same cultural sensitivity training she had gone through. It felt strange at first, standing in front of a room full of people and sharing her story. But each time she did, it became easier. She knew she wasn't just talking about her own mistakes anymore. She was speaking for something larger, the collective effort to change the culture within the airline, to make it more inclusive, more aware, and more respectful of all passengers, regardless of their background. One day, as Amanda finished a training session with a new group of recruits, one of the trainees pulled her aside. The young woman, who had only been with the airline for a few weeks, seemed nervous, but her eyes were earnest. "Hi, Amanda," she said, her voice low. "I just wanted to thank you for today's session. I wasn't sure about all this talk about bias and cultural sensitivity at first. I thought it was all just corporate stuff. But after hearing your story, I realized that I need to be more aware. It's not just about doing my job right. It's about treating people right. And I didn't really think about how much my actions could affect someone." Amanda nodded, a small but knowing smile crossing her face. "It's not always easy to see the bigger picture, but it's so important. We all have things we need to learn and unlearn, but the first step is just being willing to listen." The young woman smiled, her eyes brightening. "I'll definitely try harder to make sure I'm seeing everyone, not just as passengers, but as people." "Thank you," Amanda walked back to the crew room after the session, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. It was moments like this, when she could see the change happening in others, that made her realize how much the work she had put into herself was starting to ripple outwards. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone she interacted with. Her phone buzzed as she entered the crew lounge, a message from Linda. "Hey, Amanda. We've got a company-wide meeting next week. I was wondering if you'd like to share some of the work you've been doing on cultural sensitivity with the senior leadership team. We're really pushing for systemic change, and your experience could be a great addition to the discussion." Amanda paused, staring at the screen. The thought of speaking to senior leadership was both exciting and intimidating. She had never imagined herself in this kind of position, standing in front of the executives, sharing her personal journey. But now she understood how important it was to speak up, to be a part of the conversation, especially when it came to the changes she had worked so hard to make. With a deep breath, she responded, "I'd be honored. Let me know the details." The meeting was set for the following week, and as the date approached, Amanda spent hours preparing. She reflected on the changes she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the responsibility she felt to be a part of the larger shift within the airline. It wasn't just about presenting her personal growth. It was about showing the leadership team that true change began at the grassroots level, with people who were willing to look inward and question their own biases. On the day of the meeting, Amanda walked into the conference room where a small group of senior executives and department heads had gathered. Her hands were a little sweaty, but she squared her shoulders and took her place at the front of the room. "Thank you all for having me here today," Amanda began, her voice steady despite the nerves that swirled inside her. "I'm here to talk about something that I've learned over the past few months, something that's changed my perspective both personally and professionally. It's about cultural sensitivity, bias, and the importance of understanding not just the rules of our job, but the people we serve." She shared her journey, how the incident with the athlete had opened her eyes to the deep-seated biases she hadn't even known she carried. She spoke about the training, the lessons, and how it had reshaped her approach to passengers and colleagues alike. She shared stories from her time on the job, illustrating how even small, everyday moments could make a big impact. As she spoke, Amanda noticed that the room was quiet, everyone listening intently. For the first time, she felt that her voice wasn't just heard, it was valued. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before one of the senior executives, a woman in her 50s who had been in the industry for decades, spoke up. "I have to say, Amanda, your perspective is exactly what we need. We've been discussing changes to our training programs, but hearing it from someone who's living it is invaluable. Thank you for sharing your story. It's going to make a real difference." Amanda smiled, feeling a mix of pride and relief. She had done it. She had taken her journey, her personal growth, and turned it into something that could help others. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a catalyst for change. As the meeting ended and Amanda left the room, her heart light, she realized that her journey wasn't just about overcoming her past mistakes. It was about continuing to learn, to evolve, and to make sure that the lessons she had learned didn't stop with her. They were meant to be shared, to inspire a shift not just within herself, but within the entire airline, and hopefully, within the world. And as she walked down the hallway, her footsteps felt a little more purposeful, each one taking her closer to the future she now knew she could help create. As the weeks following her presentation passed, Amanda found herself at the forefront of a movement within the airline. The executives had taken her message seriously, and the leadership team had pledged to implement changes based on the insights she had shared. The company's commitment to cultural sensitivity, inclusivity, and anti-bias training was no longer just a discussion. It was becoming a part of the fabric of the airline. Amanda was asked to lead several more training sessions, this time with higher-level staff and even some of the airline's corporate partners. She had become an unexpected leader in this initiative, a voice of authenticity in a company that had once seemed so detached from the real-world experiences of its employees